Welcome to this explainer. Today we're taking a really fascinating journey into the neurological reality of sensory processing. If you spend any time with children, especially those on the autism spectrum, you already know that sometimes the world can just seem like an incredibly overwhelming place for them. But what is actually happening beneath the surface? Well, today we're going to build a bridge of understanding between what we see on the outside and what is truly happening on the inside of a child's nervous system.
To the parent or teacher who feels like every transition is just a battle, or the educator standing in a noisy classroom wondering how to reach a dysregulated child, I want to start by asking a question that might entirely reframe how you look at those daily struggles. Is it disobedience, or is it overload? We so often default to thinking a child is just acting out, being stubborn, or refusing to listen. But, science actually tells us a completely different story.
I really want this thought to sink in for a moment. You are not failing, and your child isn't giving you a hard time. They are having a hard time. It is so easy for us to internalize behavioral struggles as a failure of our own teaching or parenting, but as clinical data is about to show us, these moments of friction, they are rarely about defiance. They're actually about a nervous system that is experiencing the physical environment in a radically different and often painful way.
Okay, let's dive right into this. To really understand what's happening, we need to look at some landmark clinical research by Scott Tomczyk and Winnie Dunn from the American Journal of Occupational Therapy. In this massive study, researchers took 281 children with autism spectrum disorders and compared them to 281 age-matched, typically developing peers. They used an assessment called the Short Sensory Profile to measure exactly how these kids responded to everyday sensory experiences. And honestly, the results completely validate what so many parents and teachers have intuitively felt all along.
Look at this number right here, 95%. The researchers found that a staggering 95% of the children with autism in this study demonstrated some degree of sensory processing dysfunction. I mean, that is nearly every single child in the study group. So we're not talking about a rare quirk or a minor symptom here. This data proves that atypical sensory processing is a core, fundamental part of the lived experience of autism.
Now, what's really interesting here is the massive contrast in the data. If we focus on the definite difference category, meaning their scores were way outside the norm, a massive 83.6% of the autism group scored a definite difference on their total score. Compare that to just 3.2% of their typically developing peers. We are literally talking about a night and day difference in how these two groups of children physically process the world around them.
When you plot these scores out, it really brings that contrast to life. The top trend represents typically developing children, while the bottom represents children with autism. Notice how that bottom line is consistently lower across every single sensory domain we look at, from tactile to taste to movement, and in this specific assessment, a lower score means more frequent atypical behaviors. So this beautifully illustrates that the lived experience of a child with autism isn't just different in one specific area, it's a fundamentally different way of experiencing absolutely every single sense.
So where exactly are these kids struggling the most? Well, the data points us to three main culprits. A massive 86% show a definite difference in being under-responsive or seeking out sensation. 77% struggle heavily with auditory filtering, and 60% experience extreme tactile sensitivity. When a child is throwing a tantrum in a busy grocery store, they aren't just misbehaving. Their nervous systems are actively being assaulted by a world they simply cannot filter.
Let's break down that second highest culprit because it's a big one: auditory filtering. For a typically developing brain, tuning out the hum of a refrigerator or the chatter in a hallway to focus on a teacher's voice is pretty much automatic. But over 77% of the autistic children in this study struggle with this, meaning background noise literally scrambles their ability to process what you're saying. It's kind of like trying to listen to a whisper while a heavy metal concert is playing in the exact same room.
So, the crucial point is when they seem to ignore an instruction, their nervous system is actually paralyzed by sensory overload. Look at how these clinical percentages translate to real life. 73% appear to not hear what you say. 79% have difficulty paying attention. Over half don't even respond when their name is called, even though their hearing is perfectly fine. They are not ignoring you. Their auditory system is simply overloaded to the point of shutting down entirely.
All right, let's shift gears and talk about touch. Tactile sensitivity affected over 60% of the autism group. And for these children, touch isn't just touch. A scratchy clothing tag, a light brush on the arm, or the texture of certain foods, these can trigger an incredibly intense, overwhelming feeling that leads to severe anxiety and distress. Their brain is basically registering a simple, harmless touch as a literal physical threat.
And you see this manifest in daily routines all the time. Over 65% express distress during grooming, like having their hair brushed or nails cut.
56% are picky eaters, and it's purely because of food textures. But here is the really fascinating part. Notice how 70.5% seek all kinds of movement. You might look at a child bouncing off the walls and think they're just being hyperactive. But clinically speaking, this sensation seeking is actually a desperate, active attempt by the child to regulate and ground their own overwhelmed nervous system.
To really grasp the why behind all this, we've got to talk about sensory modulation. Think of it like the brain's master volume dial. It's the capacity to regulate and organize your responses to sensory input smoothly. But for the children in this study, that dial is broken. It's either stuck on maximum volume or it's completely muted. They just cannot adapt smoothly to the typical sensory challenges of daily life. And this brilliantly illustrates the paradigm shift we so desperately need right now. Traditionally, we see a child ignoring us and we label it disobedience. We see them running around the room, so we label them hyperactive. But the neurological reality proves otherwise. They aren't ignoring instructions, they're battling an auditory filtering struggle. They aren't acting out, they're suffering from a sensory modulation impairment.
The researchers ultimately define these behavioral struggles as a fundamental mismatch. It's a clash between the external demands of the child's environment, the bright lights, the loud classrooms, the scratchy clothes, and their internal physiological capacity to process it all. The behavior we see is just the friction created by this mismatch.
Building off that, the data points to some very specific environmental triggers that cause this friction. For example, 58% of these children are completely distracted by ambient noise. Over half are deeply distressed by unexpected loud noises. Because the environment is what triggers the mismatch in the first place, altering our environment based on this exact data becomes the most powerful, evidence-based tool we have to help them.
So instead of repeating commands louder when a child is melting down, try this research-informed 3-step reset. First, lower your voice to a soft whisper to cut through that auditory fatigue. Second, modify the space, reduce visual clutter or turn off bright overhead lights. Third, introduce deep pressure, like a firm shoulder squeeze or a weighted vest, to ground their nervous system before asking them to engage. Small shift, massive neurological relief.
Let's wrap up with this thought. If we know that sensory overload is the root cause of the behavior, how does changing our environment change their entire experience of the world? When we stop trying to fix the child and start adjusting the sensory world around them, we stop fighting battles and start building bridges. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this empowers you to become that sensory bridge today.